So our first speaker, our first keynote speaker of the day is Dr. Helen Cornish. She is an anthropologist at Goldsmiths, University of London, whose long-term ethnographic fieldwork has examined how modern magical religious UK witches have navigated histories and the past. She is the co-founder of the Network for an Anthropology of History in the European Association of Social Anthropologists. And she's going to be speaking to us today about Frazerian survivals, contemporary witchcraft, and the Golden Bough. So please give your full attention to Dr. Cornish.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's so nice to be here. To join these really interesting discussions, this amazing multidisciplinary collaboration. I don't think I realized until I've started listening to all of these things how much we've kind of needed, haven't we, this space to do this. So that's lovely. Okay, so have I shared my screen successfully?
Yes.
Hooray! I don't have very many images, but just to know that it's there. So thank you very much. Frazer's Golden Bough, a source of historical material, or perhaps not, as it has been demonstrated time and time again over the last century, how it fails against the empirical criteria, and that simultaneously it's this sort of, scholarly attempt to purge the record, but equally stubbornly persistent in popular culture, his speculative theories about universal myth cycles, fertility, death and rebirth, those verdant deities, the role of magic, illuminated through those unfounded 19th century theories about linear cultural progressive evolutionism, continue to be made and remade time and time again in these slightly different shapes and forms, perhaps like the dying king himself, it seems, a tale of eternal return. For this conversation for me today, I think the Golden Bough has particular pertinence for practitioners of modern magical religious traditions, witchcraft, Wicca, Druidry, in a very kind of generic, loose sense of these terms, as one of many thriving European pagan nature religions established in the 20th century, sharing a view of the earth as inherently spirited, a source of divinity, honouring the turning seasons and the growing cycles of life and death and rebirth. I can see my camera's still a bit weird. Is the sound all right?
Perfect.
Good. As long as you can hear me. Frazer's text, as we know, heavily influenced other relevant publications, Margaret Murray, Robert Graves, who all enthusiastically took up, simplified and amplified his claims as they shaped new historical orthodoxies out of it, offering a monumental history of myth and ritual for witches from Gerald Gardner onwards. Other ancestors are also available. Keen to revive ancient paganism as a source for surviving rituals, classical myth, rural folk customs, and ethnographic reports from colonial sources, deeply woven through history and practice of witchcraft. However, many decades later, magical practitioners themselves were subjecting these orthodoxies to more empirical scrutiny, demonstrating how the Golden Bough was a central part of their own origin story, deeply entwined in its history and emergence. By the time I set out on my research in round about 2000, arguments about what counted for evidence amongst witches, pagans, and others was in full flow, and raises some really important questions about the subject of history, historical knowledge, and experiences. Mm-hmm. A caveat, perhaps. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a historian. My interests are in the production of knowledge about the past in the present, how formal histories work alongside and through myth and story and folktale, more sensory, experiential forms of knowledge, perhaps materiality, ritual, landscape, singing, even dreaming. I'm not suggesting that we mistake these things as empirical forms of history, but to examine their entanglement.
Really?
And in turn, this might contribute to the cry to challenge the casual inclusion of misunderstood and outdated ideas as factual histories. But again, not by treating them as such, but to think about more diverse forms of history making. And there are, we know, many different ways of approaching the presence of Frazer in witchcraft and paganism today, through his arguments about magic, through the rich field of myth and ritual theories, to explore the impact of those classical ethnographic accounts. My focus really is more on the seasonal round, that map of folk customs and solar cycles that contributed to the construction of a formal moon of a year, a modern rationalized series of 8 festivals, counting the solstices, quarter and cross-quarter days, seem to correspond with the sequence of the growing year, ostensibly rural traditions that are presented as evidence of unchanging stability, another problematic history, and another way of imagining lost golden histories. I'm interested in how this has been positioned as a means to situate continuity, and also as holding the space for more experiential, performative forms of history. It opens the door, perhaps, for those Frazerian survivals at a time when historical orthodoxies were being challenged, and created ways to create new connections to cunning folk of earlier centuries, perhaps, as practical ancestors. There's kind of 3 things, really. I'm going to start off in a minute to describe the opening and closing rituals performed at a regional pagan federation conference in 2000 as a way of illustrating some of these ideas, where it gets historicized as, some kind of self-evident fact. And then I will offer some context for the modern magical religious witchcraft challenges to history, how it was reimagined through arguments about historical evidence, and where the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Cornwall, with its rich material histories and imaginative histories of folk magic, along with the Wheel of the Year, helped keep that door open, perhaps. And following this, I'll introduce an anthropology of history, an expanded historicity, to consider how this might help us approach these multiple ways that Frazer is found, explicitly and implicitly, in that very fabric of pagan and witchcraft practices and cosmology. But perhaps more holistically, rather than as bad history to be purged or outside the limits of history. So, to that conference. It took place on the 29th of July, just outside London at the Horth Conference Centre in Crawley. I'd attended plenty of conferences by this time to understand that these opening and closing rituals were part of the timetable, take the shape of magical rituals, but with the aim of keeping this dedicated space open throughout the day, holding a community as they attended talks, spent time in the market, stepped out for lunch, drinks and conversations. And now, while these were often aimed to create immersive ritual experiences, they were often dismissed as, pure theatrics, very different from both the intimate open rituals I was familiar with in Sussex, where all attendees had to take part, and certainly nothing like the initiate-only events that were actually not part of my research territory at all. And at this particular event, it was to introduce the celebratory theme that marked the conference and its place in the ritual year, Lammas, the first harvest, 31st of July, August the 1st, in which the enactment of the death and rebirth of the divine king was performed through the sacrifice of the corn god. It was a warm day. I'd driven maybe an hour or so from my home in Brighton, caught a lift with some friends who were involved with putting on this ritual. They were part of a relatively newly formed group, the Sussex Pagan Circle, and they'd collaborated with the PIA, the Pagan Federation, to organise it. And it was quite a big conference. There were several hundred attendees from across London, the South East, the home counties. They'd set a large marquee up in the conference gardens, the centre gardens, and as I helped set out chairs around the edges, I watched as the conveners prepared the space. They swept the stage. They arranged a large altar with candles, a chalice, a theming, salt, bread and mead, and they placed a large gong beside. The participants were arranging their robes and putting on crowns made of flowers, corn and leaves, and they waited out of sight for their cue. And we sat waiting for the marquee to fill. Slowly people arrived, small groups alone. We heard a small vibration in the air. The gong had been awakened and the performers walked onto the stage, walked the circle. And in the wake of deep reverberations, those 4 corners of the ritual circle were opened. The spirits of the north, the east, the south and the west were welcomed. One of the women stepped forward and declared the celebration of the corn harvest, Lammas, while 4 men carried in a large corn figure with movable limbs and a large buddleia penis, which was placed on the chair in the centre of the stage and announced king for the day. All those on stage stepped forward in turn and celebrated the power of the sun, the warmth, the light, the potentiality. They gave thanks for the harvest, for the wheat, and for the fruit yet to come. They gave gratitude for having survived another year and hoped for abundance for the year ahead, to keep from winter hunger, to hope for provisions and good fortune. The Corn King, we were told, would reside in the main building for the day. He would receive our wishes. We were invited to write them on paper, tuck them inside his woven body for safekeeping. They would go up in smoke when the corn god was thrown on the bonfire later that evening. So after a long day of talks and much talking, gathering around that Corn King, discussing how do you best frame a wish, warnings to be careful with what you wish for. But late in the afternoon, those same 4 men who had carried him earlier the day, dressed again in their ritual robes, hoisted him onto their shoulders, paraded through the theatre foyer and out into the grounds, where they were met with drummers who accompanied them into the gardens and through the woods into an amphitheatre, where other members of that morning team were waiting, and the completion of the celebration of the harvest could take place. The leader took up the cry and called out to give thanks to the goddess for her generosity, protection, and for the harvest. And while she was doing this, other women walked through the audience, handing out ears of wheat. We were asked to remove the chaff and to focus our attention, in the form of those wishes, on the seeds, which we were instructed to keep in a safe place for planting in the following spring. And as we did this, the drumming intensified, the other ritual members swirling and dancing between and around them. And all of a sudden, it stopped. In the silence, one man stepped forward, holding a sickle, swiftly removed the corn head from its body. As it lay on the ground, he cried out that the dying king had sacrificed himself for the fertility of the land to ensure the new growth will return. And one by one, the cardinal spirits were bid farewell, thanked, the 4 quarters of the circle closed. And slowly we drifted away in search of food and drink to await for the evening's entertainment. And behind us, a large bonfire was constructed. Much later, under the darkening sky, that decapitated Corn King, stuffed with wishes, was honoured with a final funerary speech flung onto the pyre. Now, my friends in the Sussex Pagan Circle had shared their plans for this ritual on the drive up, and they'd explained the narrative symbolism of the opening and closing of the Lammas ritual to me. They told me the story of John Barleycorn as an English myth known by other names, the Celtic lunar sun, to celebrate the sun god Lugh, with echoes from around the world, and reminded me that these are universal celebrations of the turning year and need to honour the divine world in its natural state. They described the revived English agricultural tradition of crying the neck as the last sheaf of corn was cut in the fields, and explained how corn dollies were traditionally made with the last ears of wheat in anticipation of their hungry period ahead, and they related the preparations for making that large and complex corn dolly, but they kept from me that final, shocking, sacrificial detail, in it disturbing in its suddenness. Now, this is familiar territory for many, and while there's probably much that can be said about the enactment of violence, it's easy to recognise that explicit presence of Frazerian cycles of death and rebirth and the claim to universality, that popular Frazerism that we've been hearing about. Analytically, there are inspirational precedents, anthropologists thinking this through in terms of myth or magical experience, ritual expertise, creative vernacular folklore. But I want to put it in the context of those arguments about the nature of history being had between witches and pagans in the UK at that time, and what perhaps it can illuminate. So, very brief outline. Modern magical witchcraft in very generic terms, and it won't be news to many of you, please bear with me. Contemporary witchcraft as a thoroughly modern magical religious practice, creative and inventive, while simultaneously fashioned as revitalizing traditional, even ancient customs. Different traditions and labels abound with meaningful trajectories, but they're unstable and fluctuate over time. Over 20 years ago, it was common to find, for example, witch and Wicca being used as synonyms, rather than as they are these days as claims to particular kinds of lineages. So it's not ancient, but a highly modern form of spirituality, but with that Frazerian shadow of the practices of pagan ancestors, drawing on earth mysteries, borrowing from New Age principles, transformation through creative rituals, often a polytheistic view of divinity, an animistic cosmology where a kernel of liveness inhabits the natural world. While expert historians trace its empirical roots, demonstrate the fertile combination of intellectual, romantic, and creative European movements from the 18th century are entwined with ritual magic and spiritualism. However, we also know that when Gerald Gardner, here I have some images at last for you. Oh, that's what I was going to show you. I'd forgotten about those. A retired civil servant burst into the British media in the 1950s, declaring that he had stumbled across the surviving remnants of an ancient fertility cult, witchcraft, found deep in the heart of the New Forest on the South English coast, almost exactly like that described by Margaret Murray 20 years earlier in her Witch Cult of Western Europe, where she followed Frazer's coherent myth cycle of the death and rebirth of the divine king. Although, unlike her venerated horn god, Gardner focused on worshipping the goddess, the ancient mother and matriarchy, another contemporary manifestation. Gardner's coven and publications were widely publicised through interviews. He collaborated briefly with Cecil Williamson, who was opening a museum of witchcraft and superstition on the Isle of Man, later sold to Gardner, while Williamson himself returned to the mainland, settling later in Cornwall, opening another museum in the coastal town of Boscastle, where it remains. There we go. There it remains today. Gardner's presence, as many of you know, is a public witch joined by many others, Alexanders, Cochrane, Doreen Valiente, all with distinct perspectives on continuity with the past, through claims to surviving paganism, ancient Egyptian magic, cunning traditions, and witchcraft flowed to North America and back again, bringing with it women's mysteries as feminist traditions. But in this, Frazerian survivals or surviving Frazerianisms, not entirely certain which way round this works, remain deeply knotted in the fabric of modern witchcraft. And I'll just take a brief look here at some of the texts that were recommended to me. You know, like many others of you have been relating to us, it was often recommended to me that I read The Golden Bough. Although, while some people suggested it as essential reading to learn the core cosmology of witchcraft practice, others matched this with caution. It had a difficult legacy, a problematic author. It was not a reliable history. And where I perhaps could embrace it as a compendium, a collection of diverse and extraordinary rituals, myths, and symbols. And every now and then somebody said, yeah, there's this guy, he's researched all about the symbols, he's written something, maybe, 100 years ago. And it's probably essential reading for me. But anyway, we know how well it is sedimented through popular culture, through the books, through literature, through novels, but in particular, perhaps, for me, through these histories of witchcraft and magic in Eliot, in Lethbridge, for example, but also in books written by witches, for witches, more practical guides, where it is found in the shape of reviving ancient traditions, retelling classical myth, and documenting the ritual round of festivals in the calendar year, that nascent eightfold wheel of the year, all as some kind of nod to underlying global paganism. And before Gardner shared his vision of witchcraft with the world in Witchcraft Today, and prior to the publication of the 1922 abridged version of The Golden Dawn, Alistair Crowley had urged readers to read Frazer's wise and learned words. I've got a few images here. Alongside Witchcraft Today, it's visible in Valiente's books as a source for history and practice. Sybil Leek, perhaps not seen as a reliable writer these days, but there's a lot of references to Frazer in The Complete Art of Witchcraft. Later, Alexandrian witches, Janet and Stuart Farrar, published their Witches' Bible, and here they set out the routine and history of the festivals. Frazer is a common citation, such as here in their account of Lumisar rituals, and Robert Graves is offered as a source for greater detail. And if not mentioned specifically by name, its presence is felt in the work of many others in terms of maybe Ray Breath's Hedge Witch at this point, where this closed initiatory witchcraft is opening up with more solitary individual practices becoming more common and certainly written about. It's useful in thinking about how these remain shaped by those routines of coven practices, collective rituals influenced by Gardner. Marion Green, another, in which A Witch Alone, another highly recommended text to me. After she insists on taking a critical perspective on high ritual and arcane magic, we then meet Frazerian-inspired folk customs found again in the seasonal festival. There are so many examples of this. We find Frazerian-inspired folk customs found again and again. Websites, YouTube today, Instagram, TikTok. Yet, 20 years ago, witches were having heated debates about what exactly counted as historical evidence. What was verifiable according to the documentary record? When Frazer was publishing that abridged edition of the Golden Bough a century ago, excuse me, his theories and arguments had long been seen as outdated, disregarded by anthropologists and historians who had embraced empiricism through fieldworks and documents, emphasizing the reliability of objective sociological methods rather than literary speculation. They criticized their predecessors' claims to map universal stages of cultural development, lacked conviviality, located people in other times and places as incomplete compared to that patriarchal Victorian empire, the apex of civilization from their perspective. So similarly, when in the 1950s, Gardner presented his initiatory witchcraft as a continuous practice since antiquity, this claim was barely seen as credible by professional historians, while those 19th century speculative histories of survivals that informed it, as I say, had long been dismissed as bad history. But they were compelling, continued to have this popular resonance, and as we've been talking time and again, deeply embedded as a history for the origins of an emergent modern witchcraft, thoroughly entwined with practice, difficult to disentangle, but challenged they were from practitioners to scholars between the 1970s to the 1990s, the territory of history and standards of evidence. How these were fraught and fought over, encouraged through the newly available internet. One of the early sources for me was Julia Phillips's critical overview of the history of Wicca and Gardner, where she was looking at Gardner's claims for sources, which was presented to the Canberra Wiccan Conference in 1991, shared across the internet, provided valuable resources for the increasing numbers of practitioners across the world. And I think the internet's a really important part of this story. Whole internet projects, like, this web rings, if anybody remembers these things, Pagans Against Bad History web ring, focused on producing objective standards against which factuality could be measured, demanded that those who fell for fabrications and myths should be called out, corrected, encouraged to be more reliable. There was no evidence of any remnants of any ancient pan-European fertility cult, which was based entirely on unfounded racist theories, misunderstandings, speculation. And then, of course, to meet all this, we have, in 1999, Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon, setting out a detailed evidential terrain, demonstrating which orthodoxies were unreliable and how, but crucially, offering alternatives, the carefully plotted trajectory of the multiple routes of modern witchcraft, intersections of philosophical, aesthetic, and occult strands from the 18th century onwards, fostering a fertile ground. Now, I found this being discussed in so many places and argued over, and people were, all sorts of debates and arguments that I'm happy to expand as different kinds of evidence, whether it could be taken seriously, how much it had to do with taking a public platform, things like the Pagan Federation needing to be seen as realist. But on the whole, despite some notable exceptions, within a few years, it was generally accepted that unbroken continuities might offer valuable foundation myths, but not a viable history. Now, I'm not disagreeing. I'm not suggesting, like some witches did, that the problem was a lack of evidence that witchcraft was secret, it was oral. But I am concerned that this kind of perspective only emphasizes those dominant modes of evidence and reinforces the soft power of objective historiography and naturalized historicism. So what was going on with that challenging the history of witchcraft, and how can I connect this back to those surviving Frazerianisms? Well, I think counter to expectations, or perhaps not, that outcome of realist scrutiny wasn't a turn to those empirical foundational threads, those intellectual, artistic, and esoteric movements. were not becoming the bedrock of ordinary histories of witchcraft, but instead there were other turnings towards more experiential, other kinds of myths to say, yes, there's this shallow history on the one hand, but there are other ways that perhaps don't blur or don't risk accusations of blurring myth and history. And for me, because I did quite a lot of my research down in Cornwall at the Museum of Witchcraft, the attention to cunning folk, to folk magic as something that could be found in the history, a more emotional engagement, and also this was being really centred in the Museum of Witchcraft at that time by the new owner, Graham King, who had taken Williamson's Wayside Witch and his interest in folk magic and centred it in the museum through the witch's cottage that I can show you here. Now, this is a well-entrenched trope. There is evidence of it in the historical archival records, but historians argue that there's no continuity between those cunning folk and modern witches. It's not a literal source of history. So it's another bad history, perhaps, another mythic foundational story. So I was interested then to find that this was not being presented and in so much as a literal connection, but something more esoteric, something more experiential. From this perspective, it didn't matter how people who engaged with the spirit world had organized in days gone by. It was what they did it that mattered. It contributed to historical experiences that resonated with those senses of an inspirited world. Williamson argued that he'd sought out those grassroots workers of magic, wise women and witches, call them what you will, to build his collection. His acquisition record doesn't meet objective standards. It's unreliable. His lengthy labels are full of contradictions, leaving no trace in the record. But today, at the heart of the museum, here is the wise woman in her cottage. And interestingly, it works alongside the Wheel of the Year. This is another museum exhibit, this wheel you can turn, painted by Vivian Shanley. This sequence of events that follows the rise and fall of the vegetation and the solar cycles. And the cottage is decorated according to the current phase, contextualized through earth mysteries and that sense of an animated, dynamic landscape, celebrated through these folk customs. Elsewhere in the museum, the life and death of Joan White, the alleged witch of Bodmin, whose remains are now buried in the hillside behind the town. The telling and retelling of her account, for which there is no evidence, by folklorists, writers, and visitors, weave her likeness more and more as akin to a missing link between the ancient priestesses and modern witches, a kind of natural history of witchcraft, brought together through, I think, this Wheel of the Year exhibit. So rather than think about myth or folklore or ritual theory, I want us to think about this kind of anthropology of history through this expanded historicity. History as an analytical category has been an anthropological question since the historical turn in the 1980s, hot on the heels of the recognition that not only is culture historical, but that history is cultural. Famously, Sarlin's addressed this by examining structures, how events become historical. But instead, here I follow the work of others, Lambert, Stewart, Parmigiani, and Palmy, who are concerned with how the past is articulated and formulated in the present, and how an anthropology of historicity can provide a valuable approach, somewhat in contradiction with those historicists' conventional notions of historicity as a means to evaluate literal factuality. Instead, here it attends to those cultural perceptions of the past, grounded in temporality, to consider how people learn, construe, represent the past, where time is not always conceived of as linear. Orderly senses of past, present, and future are sometimes unstable. And it helps alleviate that need to measure against standard Western historicism. It's neither historical ethnography nor about adjudicating between, say, an empirical and local accounts. And there are three things. Firstly, an expanded historicity doesn't downplay or marginalize the everyday production of the past by practitioners, but recognizes different varieties of historical registers. It brings objective empirical history into the same set of processes as, say, myth, memory, or folklore. And while I think we're all very aware that historians and other scholars have made huge inroads into challenging the dominance of Enlightenment historicism, debates about the value of myth or memory, for example, continue to be located as socially important, but we know they're not accorded the same value as historical knowledge. where objective, measurable interpretations of the past are prioritized, perhaps naturalized, like one of Trujillo's Atlantic universals. So then perhaps, secondly, we can think about how it opens out possibilities for other forms of experience. I can turn to Michael Lambert's work with the Sakalava spirit mediums in northern Madagascar, who bring the ancestors from the past into the present, erupting into the spaces between history and memory, between official and popular accounts. It's not the same thing as a history or a number of histories. Or Charles Stewart's ethnography of dreaming on the Greek island of Naxos, where dreams are taken seriously as a form of historical consciousness and as evidence towards the retrieval of buried icons during times of precarity, where prophecies and premonitions are an acceptable kind of epistemology. And in Italy, Giovanna Parmigiani uses historicity as expanded temporality to explore the nuances of history and tradition, as a small group of pagan women in Salento, southern Italy, embrace a traditional local dance as a form of spiritual healing practice that untethers linear temporality, unleashing the past into the present. So, through understanding complexities of historical experience, these ethnographies reveal the specificities of European historicity, naturalized, produced through Enlightenment and scientific principles, where it is considered inevitable that the past is a series of unrepeatable events and obvious that they are organized in linear fashion. But how histories are made is more diverse, more creative, more imaginative, less, perhaps, ordinary. Philosophical discussions can consider how the imagination and the senses have been downplayed in Enlightenment philosophies, the visionary power of scientific hypothesis, the role of poetic invention in stories of progress and other grand narratives. And think of the work of Tim Ingold, who takes modern science to task for their insistence that the realms of reality and the imagination should not be confused. Susan Greenwood challenges academic theories of magic, marginalized by Western cultural history, how it always fails against rationalist criteria. Her arguments about magical consciousness, associative thinking, taking the imaginal seriously, Sabina Magliocco's account of participatory consciousness, all of these are crucial to our experience of humanity in the past. The ecologist David Abram urges his readers to recognize that making sense requires sensual awareness rather than a literal truth, recommends a more animated perspective of the world. What's crucial here is that this does not measure myth or folklore or even singing a ritual against realist criteria and say, well, it works for some people, but it's not history, but instead finds more expansive ways of including these varieties of historical experience, as well as weaving and recognizing those realist strands through. So reconfiguring historicity perhaps involves an expanded imagination. And to conclude, perhaps, there is something a little disturbing, that shadow of progressive histories, when the take-up of literal histories and empirical evidence is applauded, underwriting perhaps a little how things or how little things have changed from Frazer's concern that the peasants' ignorance would be relieved by increasing secularization and modernity. I think we need to heed these warnings, and maybe by thinking through an expanded historicity, those Frazerian narratives, the survivals, whatever we want to call them, can be included as part of more effective or poetic pasts that do not have to be dismissed from the category of history in such a singular way. But at the same time, obviously, we need to recognize that these are unreliable evidence in terms of a literal history, at the same time as it represents this enduring presence as part of that empirical history of witchcraft being made and remade time and again. And perhaps this helps find room for the different ways that the Golden Bough is found in those spaces through memory and history over time, allows the possibilities of mapping against these different responses from both popular and scholarly perspectives, and those ideas that guide how people make and remake historical events as active processes, such as the ones that we're finding in these rituals, events, and the stories and performances and the retelling of the events through the ritual year. Thank you very much for your time.